Stop the world!
Spending more money on defense is not going to make us more secure unless we deal with China's economic warfare. So to start, we need to understand that when we opened our economies to China in particular, it took advantage of that opportunity to attack us from inside our own systems. So what happened is that China nested itself inside our economic and industrial systems and then set upon unleashing a really sophisticated campaign of economic warfare. And that campaign allowed it to amass the military power that now threatens us.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Today we have Canadian defence and strategic expert Raquel Garbers reacting to the major news that NATO members will aim to increase their defence spending to 5% of GDP. Raquel is a career Canadian defence and intelligence official who is currently a visiting executive at the Centre for International Governance Innovation.
Raquel has some strikingly clear views on the value of the spending increases, but also the way they need to be paired with a stronger focus on economic warfare by hostile states, particularly China. She talks about the rationale for more defence investment, Canadian and Australian public opinion about military spending, the two countries' strategic circumstances, and how Donald Trump plays into Canadian thinking.
Raquel shares her deep concerns about Chinese economic warfare against open economies such as Canada's and Australia's, the need for democratic nations to work together through industrial policies such as friendshoring, and how NATO members, and anyone else including Australia who might be looking to up their defence spending, need to ensure a defence boost doesn't ultimately play into China's economic warfare campaign.
Raquel is a force of nature with a worldview that is crystal clear. Listen carefully and we hope you enjoy this conversation.
I'm here with Raquel Garbers. Raquel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, thank you.
So we've had the NATO agreement in the last couple of days to increase defence spending to 5% of GDP, including 3.5% core military funding. It's been widely hailed as an important step. What's your overall view of it? How significant is it? How watertight? Crucially, how realistic and achievable is it for the countries?
So I think what's important to know is that the allies, in agreeing to hit the 5% mark, have in effect as a group finally acknowledged the gravity of the security environment and the reality that they are at growing possibilities of finding themselves in a war for which we are collectively quite ill prepared. Defense spending is absolutely essential. As you no doubt know, at the end of the Cold War, the Allies collectively allowed their militaries to fall into a relative decline. But in addition to defense spending, and to ensure that defense spending actually enhances their security, what the Allies really need to do is cast aside the mindset that they adopted at the end of the Cold War, which, as you probably know, was something to the effect of, if we include hostile states and we embrace them and we bring them into our systems, we will ensure that we are on the path to peace and riches. So effectively, the argument that was championed by the foreign policy and economic elites of the time to the effect that interdependence would pacify hostile states. And of course, the Allies, when they embraced that fantasy, made two fateful mistakes. The first was that they downshifted their defense spending, and the second was that they opened their economies to the hostile states. So they really need to correct that first and foremost.
I definitely want to come back to that in more detail, and we'll unpack that in the second half of the podcast. I want to spend some time on it. First of all, I mean, just the achievability. I mean, we're talking about extraordinary sums of money. We in Australia, we're stuck at around 2% of GDP. We're having a not always edifying debate about where to take that. And I'll come back to that as well. But tell me about Canadians. Are Canadians behind this increase? And just for the context for our listeners, I believe, I mean, from my reading, Canada's currently at around 1.4% of GDP. So to get to 3.5 core funding, leaving aside the 1.5 in addition that can possibly be done through a bit of creative accounting. I mean, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but really the 3.5 to me is the key number. Canadians will have to find roughly $50 billion a year. Now, that's just a back of the envelope calculation that I did a few minutes before we jumped on air. It could be wrong. Happy to be corrected on it. But I mean, even $50 billion a year out of Canada's budget through tax increases, through cuts elsewhere, I imagine is a pretty significant burden. Are Canadians up for that? And if so, what is motivating them?
To be frank with you, I think it was the arrival of Donald Trump, Trump 2.0, that really, quite frankly, not simply in Canada, but across the alliance, made clear that defense spending was no longer optional. It was an absolute necessity. And I think Canadians understand and have been proud in the past of their military history and the contributions that we've made. And they understand now that the world is spiraling out of control and defense spending is essential. They also understand that it's going to be essential to the future of our relationship with the United States, as well as with our other allies. We, as you probably know, the Prime Minister has committed to getting Canada to 2% of GDP within this year, which leaves us a 1.5% climb over the course of a decade. Is Canada able to do that? And will Canadians do that? The answer is, as seems to always be the case for us in Canada, we are in a really, really envious position vis-a-vis other allies. And I'll tell you that's for two reasons. The first is that Canada has the natural resources that the world needs right now. We have the oil and gas that will allow the allies to rid themselves of their dependencies on Russia, for example, for energy. And of course, this is happening in the midst of a manufacturing renaissance, a friendshoring. So not just to power their own defense industrial base, but to power their broader industrial base. Canada has the resources that the allies need. This gives us customers. So growth is an answer for us, and it's custom made. The second reason why Canada is particularly blessed is that we can offer the allies something that nobody else can, other than the United States, which is what I call defense in depth. And what that means is because we are not sitting in the hot zone, in the first stages of conflict, we are a secure location in which to manufacture and stockpile munitions and other weapons and industrial capability for the defense industrial base. So allies who are looking to secure their access and ability to produce weapons would be well advised to make those investments in Canada. So because we can offer defense in depth by virtue of geography, and because we have the resources that the world needs, we are in an enviable position where we can get to 3.5 in a way, quite frankly, where we're helping the allies, but we're also advancing our own economic growth. It's growth for us as opposed to a drain.
Fascinating. And a fascinating comparison with Australia. We, of course, are blessed with natural resources as well, but who the customer is might be a slightly different question for us right now. But again, we can come back to that. Now, I mean, we talk about social license a lot in Australia. National security experts and our own officials talk about it quite a lot. Our own defence officials, our military leaders, etc., talk about the intel heads talk about the need for social license, the value of social license, i.e., making sure that our public understands the value of these sorts of investments. Critics of the more complacent position, which we are arguably still stuck in here in Australia, sometimes argue that we don't have a very frank debate in this country about the nature of the strategic risks, primarily China, and therefore we don't have a foundation for a political case for increasing defence spending. Now, that said, and again, context for our listeners is quite interesting. The Lowy poll, another think tank here in Australia which does annual polling, it's very reputable, has found just in recent weeks, half the population, 51% of Australians, say Australia should increase defence spending. A minority, which is 37%, say Australia should keep defence spending about the same level as now, and only 10% say that it should be decreased. Describe the comparable context in Canada and your observations generally across NATO and elsewhere for what makes a nation come alive to growing strategic threats. I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump. I assume, though, that Trump, in a sense, is sort of the messenger here. I mean, there are the underlying strategic risks. In Canada's case, being in North America, you've got Russia, and you're a NATO member as well. You've got Russia, but as an Indo-Pacific country, you've also got China as well. You're in a very interesting position. How alive to the underlying strategic risks are Canadians, irrespective of the Trump pressure that has been brought to bear in the last 6 months?
That's a great question. I'm actually going to start from how you described Australia. And I would say that Canada, in many respects, is in precisely the opposite position of Australia. You are sitting right next to the greatest military threat we face as allies. And you are also economically tied to that threat by virtue of geography. Canada, by contrast, is sitting right next door to the anchor ally whose military capabilities have ensured the defense of all of us for 80 years. And moreover, as you likely know, a really, really high percentage of Canada's economic dependence is tied to the United States, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 plus percent. So we are in precisely the opposite position. And yet I would say for years, Canada has lagged behind Australia in terms of waking up to the reality of the threat environment because we haven't been sitting next door to it. Canadians have not had to think seriously about national defense since the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, when the United States stood alone as the sole great power in the international order, and Canada is geographically attached to the United States, it allowed us to fall into, I would say, an even greater complacency than that of the other allies. And so waking up to that threat for Canadians, I'm not actually sure that we are fully there. I think we understand that something has happened. We are grappling right now, I would say, in the public narrative with the false equivalency that some commentators are putting out with regard to the United States and China. And so the debate that you're having with regard to what to do about China, given the economic relationship, what's happening here in Canada is that you have some influential commentators suggesting that Canada should lessen its dependency on the United States by deepening its economic relationship with China. And that, to me, suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how the world found itself in the position it's in, the gravity of the threat we face, and the reality of the options available to Canada. So I think that would strategically, I would say to you that Canadians are beginning to understand it. But after, 3 decades of sitting next door to one of history's more benign hegemons, it's not something that comes naturally to us.
Right. The irony for me is that probably Canada investing is going to send a stronger signal to the Australian public than almost any other country. I mean, you make a very good point about the geostrategic differences between us in terms of where we're physically located, and it's a very, very important point. You've got, as Donald Trump would put it, two beautiful oceans on either side of you. Although there's an archipelago, I guess that makes a bit of a difference. But where we are, very different geostrategic situation, but Australians look at Canadians, I think, as probably closer in character and political colour than almost any other country. I mean, we're both US allies, we're both Commonwealth countries, we're both obviously Anglophone countries with British heritage, and we're both, sort of fairly mild-mannered nations, if I can put it that way as well. So, ironically for me, probably Canada investing in this way is actually a very, very strong signal to the Australian public. Your Prime Minister, Mark Carney, I think is probably the sort of, from Australians' point of view, as this sort of, wonderful technocrat who has shown his spine against Trump, who is not popular here. To us, in some ways, he's a sort of a dream leader. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that sort of plays in the Australian sort of, I guess, public political discussion. Just talk to me about what your advice on how governments kind of get ahead of the long-term strategic risk. What's a good message in your mind for governments to talk honestly with their publics about the nature of risk well ahead of when it materializes, sufficiently ahead so that they can make the investments both in a deterrent effect, but also for a preparedness effect. These big investments that need to be made, 5-10 years in advance of the where the real threat kicks in. I mean, how do you actually sort of make that argument when it hasn't fully materialized in the eyes of the public?
Well, I think it depends on which threat you're focused on. I mean, the reality is, as I'm sure you know, we can trace back at least 15 years to US administrations, Democratic and Republican alike, starting with Barack Obama, being increasingly clear with the allies that the threat environment was changing in a way, and the balance of power was shifting away from the United States in a way that was leading to the point where the US could no longer ensure global peace unless the allies all stepped up. And of course, what we needed to happen didn't really happen. And we've now reached the point where the evidence of the breakdown of the post-Cold War order is very clear. And it's clear to the average person as well, which, is unfortunate, but also I think answers your question in part. The reality is that, Russia is waging a war in Ukraine. China is increasingly aggressive with its neighbors, both in terms of its military intimidation and harassment, but really more broadly with its economic warfare. The prospect of conventional war between major powers has never been higher, and people are talking about that. And there's a growing real risk of nuclear proliferation. And some US officials or official documents have actually made statements to the effect that the outcome of any war between China and the United States would be far from certain. So it's against that backdrop that we see Trump 2.0 accelerating the trend line that started with Barack Obama about getting the allies ready for the inevitable moment that we are now in. So I think the evidence of what's actually going on in the world makes its own case.
Yeah.
The challenge for governments is to explain how we got into that space in order to better understand what we need to do to navigate our way out of it in order to restore the ability to deter war. And it's a very basic one-liner, in fact, that I think governments need to adopt, which is to say, if we want to deter war, we need to restore our ability to win a war. It's that simple. And it's, peace through strength is the catch line, but I think we need to dig a little deeper on that. And we need to explain to our publics in more detail how it is that we lost the ability to fight, both in terms of capabilities and our political will.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. Unpacking peace through strength seems to be a really, really great starting point. Let's speaking of unpacking, let's go back to your point about how NATO allies spend that 5% of GDP. I mean, you touched on your concern there about, I suppose, about global supply chains and the economic, the predatory economic intentions of hostile nations, presumably China in particular. Just can you talk us through what your concerns are there?
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, because I think it's the most critical thing that publics need to understand. Spending more money on defense is not going to make us more secure unless we deal with China's economic warfare. So to start, we need to understand that when we opened our economies to China in particular, it took advantage of that opportunity to attack us from inside our own systems. So what happened is that China nested itself inside our economic and industrial systems and then set upon unleashing a really sophisticated campaign of economic warfare. And that campaign allowed it to amass the military power that now threatens us. So the two inconvenient truths that all allies need to be honest about is that in failing to arrest China's economic warfare, we could be accused of inadvertently subsidizing its war machine. And worse still, if we fail to confront that economic warfare now, then when we gush hundreds of billions of dollars into our defense industrial base in order to meet the NATO 5% or 3.5% spending target, we put ourselves at risk of making the adversaries even stronger than they already are. So dealing with economic warfare is essential. And it's not just about our broader economic security and insulating ourselves from economic coercion. It's about educating people about the military implications in particular that flow from China's economic warfare.
You seem to be talking virtually about decoupling then. Is that a fair description of it? I mean, if not $1 of this additional spending ought to flow through to supply chains that in which China plays a part, is there not a massive disentanglement, decoupling that needs to, I guess, precede this spending?
Well, I think on the face of it, it's pretty logical that it is impossible to secure an economy against economic warfare when that is an open economy in which the adversary has nested itself? How do you secure yourself against an adversary that is inside your own systems? So full decoupling, I'm not sure about that, but it's certainly a very hard pivot towards full decoupling, I think, is essential. And that is the more difficult conversation that will need to be had with the publics in the allied populations.
Very, very interesting. Canada joined ReArm Europe. What does that mean? So just talk me through what that means. I mean, I suppose from the defence industry point of view, and you mentioned the friendshoring and the opportunities, the enviable position that Canada is in. Just talk me through the significance of Canada's membership of or joining of ReArm Europe. I think it's 800 billion euros that is being talked about there, and what does it mean for Canada's defence relations with the United States?
So I actually don't know the exact number offhand.
No, that's right.
It gets translated into US dollars, but I would say this: Canada, for the reasons we talked about earlier, yes, is in an enviable position in terms of being able to grow to 3.5% through growth rather than through cuts or reallocations. So that's a really good piece of news for us. From that perspective, ReArm Europe, if it opens up new markets for Canadians to sell into, then that's all for the good, and it's growth that will finance the rise to the 3.5 as well. The other reason why Canada, of course, is interested in ReArm Europe is in order to lessen our dependency on the United States. There's a practical reason for that, which is that the entire world is trying to gear up its defense industrial base. And so the more that we are collectively supporting one another in that, the better off we all are. We can't all stand in line with the US supply chains, or we won't have the weapons that we need more broadly. Everybody needs to be ramping up their defense industrial base. There's also the issue that Canadians feel that the Americans could be unreliable, and therefore they want to pivot to Europe. So there's many good reasons to diversify. The concern, I think, for the government will be to ensure that it's managed diversification and to prepare the population for the reality that we are not realistically going to decouple from the United States. It poses far too many military and economic risks to make a hard pivot to Europe with regard to the defense industrial base. And I'd like to just talk about the military risks for a moment. The first concern has to be that North America is one geographic space. That means that we are a single attack surface. When you are a single attack surface, you need an integrated defense posture. Two countries that need to be working together as seamlessly as an orchestra. So there are limits to mixing and matching equipment from Europe with the equipment that the Americans use, because if you do so and you do it with the wrong equipment, you introduce a glitch into North American defenses and you put yourself at risk. So that's one real military risk. The second is, to be very frank, the possibility of investing in lesser quality technologies. The United States remains the world's largest and most technologically advanced military in the world. Why would we not want the most advanced technologies defending us in an increasingly dangerous threat environment? So that's another limitation that the government will need to consider. The third one for me is really more of a geopolitical view, and it's the one that concerns me the most: security of supply. We're in a new world order here. And there's a little bit of raw power politics and raw power realities that come into play. In the event of a crisis, if we are sitting on a list of potential clients for European industry, we can be sure that if Europe is under attack, the supplies will go to European partners on the list, regardless of where we sit, simply because Europe's first priority will be to defend Europe. From that perspective, we are better served to sit on a U.S. supply list because the U.S., in its own self-interest and for its own national defense, will want to prioritize deliveries to Canada because we are the United States partner in the defense of North America. So in terms of preparing for the worst moment, we had best not over pivot to Europe. Finally, the last thing I would say, coming back to the threats posed by economic warfare, if European controls on China's economic warfare are not sufficiently robust, we risk investing in capabilities that have Chinese DNA in them and will never be, therefore, accepted into the integrated defense of North America. And that's a reality, quite frankly, that Australia needs to think about as well. If you are investing in capabilities that are compromised from the get-go, those capabilities will not come into play in a conflict.
I mean, in my wobblier moments about Donald Trump, and I have them almost daily, I do look to Europe as, as a potential, future ballast of reason in the world and liberal democracy. But I must say, I, with the best will in the world, my attitude for the last 6 months has been have a plan B for the worst, but certainly continue to hope for the best and do your best to try and work as an ally with the United States, irrespective of what concerns you might have about future reliability. Because, I mean, certainly in Australia's case, the realistic prospect of self-sufficiency or moving fully away from the United States, or even substantially away from the United States, is a very, very tentative reality. I see your arguments entirely in the case of Canada there. Look,
I mean, diversification is great and it's important. It just needs to be very thoughtfully and carefully done. And I'm sure the government understands that. The reality is we need all of us producing weapons. And we all need to be ensuring that our defense industrial bases are secured against economic warfare, because we all need to be able to rely on each other's security and each other's military capability.
Yep,
we're in it together.
I couldn't hear. I couldn't agree more. Okay, Raquel, you've been very generous with your time. I realise I don't know what time it is where you are, but I'm sure it's past bedtime. So, look, thank you. And at the short notice, we wanted to get your thoughts because they're so important on these NATO spending questions. So, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, folks. We'll be back next week with more Stop the World.